It all started on a seemingly ordinary evening. The kind where nothing feels out of place, where the world moves forward without warning, without care for the quiet storm that's brewing just beneath the surface. My name is Jane. And if you're wondering how things got this bad, let me tell you, it wasn't overnight. No, this has been a slow unraveling of everything I thought I knew. I should have known. I should have trusted my instincts when I first saw it. That message on Philip's, my husband's, phone. We were sitting on the couch, the house quiet except for the hum of the TV. He was half watching, half scrolling through his messages when I caught a glimpse of the screen. Just a few words, nothing overtly suspicious at first glance. But it felt off, like a shard of glass buried deep in my mind, slowly piercing through. I can't wait to see you tonight, the message read. And it was signed, R. Who the hell was R? A client? A friend? But why did it feel wrong? My heart began to race, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The seed had been planted, and no matter how much I tried to bury it, it kept sprouting. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't just the message. No, it wasn't just that. It was the way Philip had been acting lately, distant, distracted, almost like he wasn't really here, even when he was. And then there was Helen, my sister, the one person I thought I could always rely on. I hadn't noticed it at first, but looking back, it was so obvious. The way she and Richard had been acting around each other. The stolen glances, the subtle smiles shared when they thought no one was watching. Every time they crossed paths at family gatherings, it was like there was some unspoken tension between them, something thick enough to slice with a knife. I'd seen it, but I'd dismissed it, because I wanted to believe the best in everyone, especially my own sister. It didn't make sense, not at first. Helen had always been a little more carefree, but never like this. And Richard, our new tenant, he seemed harmless enough, quiet, polite, nothing to worry about. But then, as the weeks passed, something changed. There was a shift in the air when he entered the room. I could feel it, like the subtle change in temperature before a storm. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. That I was overthinking it. But there it was again, Helen's laugh, a little too loud, a little too familiar when Richard made a joke. Or that moment when their hands brushed as they passed each other in the kitchen, and the way their eyes lingered for a second too long. It was all so small, so easy to ignore. But not to me. Not anymore. And then came that night. I'd been feeling restless all day, like something was off. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it. I walked past Philip's study and noticed his phone on the desk, the screen lit up. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether I should touch it. But the doubt gnawed at me, and against my better judgment, I picked it up. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was because I felt like I had no other choice. Maybe it was because deep down, I was already afraid of what I might find. But I looked through his messages. And that's when I found it. A text from Richard, plain as day, and it was clear. Philip had been helping him. Helping him with Helen. I felt the world tilt on its axis. My stomach turned. My breath caught in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was real. My husband. My sister. And Richard. They were all tangled together in a web of lies. And I was the last one to know. I confronted Philip that night. His eyes shifted uncomfortably as I laid the phone on the table between us. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking, but trying to hold it together. He looked at me like I was the crazy one. "What do you mean?" His response was so casual, so indifferent, that it made my skin crawl. "It's nothing, Jane. Just a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. That's what he said. And just like that, my doubts grew deeper. I could see it in his eyes, he wasn't sorry. He was hiding something. I didn't know what to do next. The foundation beneath me felt like it was crumbling, and I was standing on the edge, watching it all fall apart. But I had to know the truth. I had to understand how deep this betrayal went. If you think you've felt the pain of betrayal, trust me, you have no idea. And if you want to know how this story unfolds, you better stick around. Because it's only going to get worse. Subscribe now, and don't miss the next chapter of this twisted tale. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. But the cracks kept showing up, and each time I tried to ignore them, they only seemed to grow wider. The message on Philip's phone was just the beginning. That night, after our conversation, the air in the house felt heavy, like it was waiting for something to explode. I thought I had it under control, that I could still fix things, but deep down, I knew it was already slipping away. The next few days were unbearable. Every time I looked at Philip, I could feel the lies between us. Every time I looked at Helen, I felt the betrayal in my gut. But the worst part? It wasn't just the people closest to me who were keeping secrets, it was Richard too. And I had no idea what his role was in all of this. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was sitting in the kitchen, trying to keep my mind occupied. The house felt quieter than usual, and the weight of the silence pressed in on me. That's when I heard them. The voices. Low at first, barely above a whisper, but as the argument picked up, I could hear every word clearly. They were coming from the garage. Philip's and Richard's voices. I didn't know why I felt this sudden urge to listen, but I couldn't help myself. I crept toward the door and pressed my ear against the wood, straining to catch every word. I told you, this needs to stop. She's not going to buy it forever, Richard. Philip's voice was sharp, filled with anger, but there was something else in it, fear, maybe. I don't care if she finds out. It's you I'm worried about. You're the one she'll believe, Richard shot back, his tone cold and calculating. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath me. They were talking about me. About us. And I could hear the venom in their voices, the way they spoke like I was the fool, the one being played. Philip was panicking. Richard was so calm, almost detached. There was no hesitation in his words. I'm not the one who has to keep up appearances. You're the one with the family, Philip. You're the one who's going to lose everything if she finds out. I couldn't breathe. My hands were trembling as I stood there, hidden in the shadows. I didn't want to hear more, but I couldn't pull myself away. You don't get it, do you? Philip was nearly shouting now. She won't leave. She won't. She'll never believe you. Then maybe it's time for her to find out. You've waited too long already, don't you think? Richard's voice dropped to a low whisper. I heard a door slam. The conversation ended. But it didn't end in my mind. I stood there for what felt like hours, processing what I'd just heard. The truth was out there, and it was uglier than anything I could have imagined. But I still didn't have all the pieces. Not yet. I needed to understand how deep this went. I needed to figure out what had been happening when I wasn't looking. Looking back, I never should have trusted Richard. When he first moved in, I thought he was harmless, a quiet, kind man, someone I thought could use a fresh start. It was so simple, so easy to just accept him into our home. He had nowhere else to go, and we had the space. Philip and I thought it was the right thing to do. He was polite, respectful, the kind of person you wouldn't second guess. I remember the first time I met him, a few months ago, when he came to look at the place. His smile was warm, genuine. He seemed like he had a good heart. I told myself he was just someone passing through, someone who needed a little help. A small act of kindness. I never imagined then that he'd be the one to tear everything apart. But here we were. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized Richard had been playing me from the start. I wasn't the only one hiding things. Helen was acting differently too. At first, it was just small things. She started coming home later, spending more time with Richard when she thought I wasn't around. But then, it got worse. She'd disappear at odd hours, always with some vague excuse. I'd ask her where she was going, and she'd brush it off, saying she was out with friends or running errands. But I knew something was off. One night, I decided to follow her. I couldn't stop myself anymore. I had to know where she was going. It wasn't like me to snoop, but I couldn't let this go on. I couldn't let them all lie to me. I waited until Helen left the house, slipping out quietly, just like I'd seen her do before. I grabbed my coat and slipped out behind her, careful not to make a sound. I followed her down the street, keeping my distance, watching her every move. She walked with purpose, like she knew exactly where she was going. And then I saw it. Richard's car parked in the alley, just ahead. They met there, in the shadows, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear everything they said, but the body language was enough. Helen looked nervous, her arms crossed tightly in front of her. Richard, on the other hand, stood with his back straight, calm, almost like he was in control. I watched for what felt like an eternity, unable to tear my eyes away. And then, just as I was about to confront them, they parted ways. Helen walked away, her head down, lost in her thoughts. Richard climbed into his car and drove off without a second glance. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to do. But one thing was clear, I wasn't just dealing with Philip anymore. I was dealing with both of them. Together. And I had to figure out how to stop it before it was too late. I couldn't sleep. I hadn't slept properly in days, maybe weeks. My mind raced with fragments of conversations, snatches of words that never quite made sense before, but now they were all I could hear. I kept replaying every interaction, every odd look, every moment that felt just a little too calculated. I had to put the pieces together. I had to make sense of this chaos, this web of lies that was suffocating me. The problem was, the more I thought about it, the more the truth seemed to slip through my fingers. Each time I tried to hold on to something solid, it turned to dust. Richard's presence in our lives, once so benign, now felt like a cancer. And Helen, my own sister, wasn't just a bystander in this mess. She was part of it. I started keeping a mental tally of the things they said. The small discrepancies, the things that didn't add up. It was subtle at first, but over time, it became glaringly obvious. Richard would tell me one thing, then tell Helen something entirely different. I noticed it when we were having casual conversations around the house. Richard would talk about his work, his background, things that seemed harmless enough, but when I asked Helen about them later, her version of his story didn't match his. And it wasn't just that they were different. It was like they were deliberately trying to confuse me, to keep me guessing. But I couldn't let that go. No matter how hard I tried to push it out of my mind, the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong only grew stronger. I couldn't ignore the inconsistencies anymore. And I wasn't about to wait around for them to confess. I had to know the truth. I had to hear it from them. I decided to confront Richard. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. But it was something I couldn't put off any longer. I waited until we were alone one afternoon. Philip was out, Helen was in her room, and I found Richard in the living room, reading a book, as usual. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes narrowing slightly, but his expression remained calm. Too calm. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, but I pushed through the fear. "Richard," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, Jane?" I took a deep breath. "I need to know what's going on. I need to know the truth. Everything." His face didn't change, but his eyes flickered with something that almost felt like guilt. For a moment, I thought he might just tell me. But then, he leaned back in his chair and shrugged, the same nonchalant gesture that had always irked me. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "There's nothing to tell." I felt the anger well up inside me. I had expected him to deny it, but not so easily. "Don't lie to me, Richard. I know there's something going on. You've been lying to me, and I can see it. I see the way you look at Helen, the way you two talk when you think I'm not listening. His eyes shifted to the side, and for a split second, I saw it, just a flicker of something dark behind them. Then it was gone, replaced by the same calm, controlled exterior. I don't know what you're talking about, Jane, he said again, his tone cold now, dismissive. I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Please, Richard. Just tell me the truth. I need to understand what's going on. Why are you here? Why did you come into our lives, and why does it feel like you're trying to tear everything apart? He didn't respond right away, and for a moment, the silence between us felt suffocating. But then, his lips parted, and he spoke in a voice that was almost too quiet. I'm not the one who's tearing anything apart, Jane, he said, his gaze locking onto mine. I'm just here to live my life. What happens between you, Helen, and Philip is your business, not mine. But there was something in his eyes, something that made my stomach turn. Before I could say anything else, I turned to leave the room, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on me. He didn't say anything else, didn't stop me, and I couldn't decide if that made things worse or better. As I made my way down the hallway, I saw Helen standing in the kitchen. She was talking to Richard, her back to me, but I could hear their voices low and conspiratorial, like they were in on something I wasn't. And that's when it happened. It was so subtle, I almost didn't notice it. Helen had been laughing at something Richard had said, her hand lightly resting on his arm. But as I walked past, I caught the way they both froze for just a second. It was like they both knew I was watching, like they were caught in the middle of something they shouldn't have been. Then, just as quickly, they returned to their conversation, but it was too late. I had seen it, their chemistry, their closeness, the way they touched each other without even realizing it. I knew then. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. It wasn't just some coincidence. They were hiding something. And it was bigger than I had ever realized. I tried to push the thought away, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't. My world had been turned upside down in just a few moments. And now, I was more lost than ever. I never thought I would find myself doing this. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would invade someone else's privacy, especially not Philip's. But I was desperate. I needed answers, and my instincts told me that I wasn't going to get them from Richard or Helen. They had mastered the art of avoiding the truth, of dodging questions with fake smiles and convenient excuses. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. One evening, when Philip was out, I found myself sitting at his desk. I knew it was wrong, but the temptation was overwhelming. I had to know what was really going on. I sat in the chair, staring at his laptop, my fingers trembling as I opened it. I knew his password. He'd never been very good at hiding things. And just like that, I was inside. I didn't even know what I was looking for, but my eyes quickly found what they were searching for. The inbox. The emails. And there, sitting among the countless messages from work and friends, was one from Richard. The subject line alone made my heart stop. Just like old times. My fingers hovered over the mouse, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn away. But I couldn't. I clicked, and there it was. The truth. The message was simple, almost casual, as though it were a conversation between two old friends. But the content made my blood run cold. Richard had written to Philip, talking about how much they had enjoyed their time together, their secret moments. And then there it was, the line that shattered everything. I can't wait for Helen to come over again. It's been too long. I felt the world tilt beneath me. The room spun, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The weight of what I was reading hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just Richard and Helen. It was Philip too. My own husband, the man I had trusted more than anyone, was in on it. They had been in this together from the start. And I was the fool who had been blind to it. 1,000 memories rushed back to me, the early days of our relationship, when Philip and I had been so happy, so in love. It felt like a lifetime ago. I remembered our first date, how he had smiled at me with such warmth, how we had talked about our future, our plans. I remembered the way he looked at me when we got married, as if I were the most important person in the world to him. I thought he was my rock, my safe place. But now, everything was a lie. I leaned back in the chair, the email still open in front of me, my mind reeling. I wanted to scream, to throw the laptop across the room, to demand an explanation. But I didn't. I couldn't. I felt numb. But I couldn't stay there forever. I couldn't let this moment define me. I had to do something. I couldn't keep pretending I didn't know. So, I waited. When Philip came home that evening, I pretended nothing was wrong. I smiled, made small talk, and acted like everything was normal. But inside, my world had crumbled. I was suffocating, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep up the facade. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about confronting him, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. I wasn't going to let him see how broken I was, how much he had destroyed me. I needed to find the right moment, the right words. But then, there was Helen. She came over the next day, like she always did. I watched as she and Philip shared their usual pleasantries, their fake smiles, their little inside jokes. She was so good at pretending, at playing the part of the loving sister, the supportive friend. But I saw through it. I knew now. I knew everything. It was time. I called Helen later that afternoon, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. When she picked up, her voice was bright, cheerful, as usual. "Hey, Jane. What's up?" I felt a lump form in my throat, but I pushed it down. I had to stay calm. "Helen, I need to talk to you. Right now." There was a brief silence on the other end, and I could almost hear her hesitation. "Sure, Jane. What's going on?" "I know everything," I said, my voice steady, but my heart was racing. "I know about you and Richard, about you and Philip. I've seen the emails. I know you've been lying to me." The silence was deafening. And then, her voice came through, soft but full of guilt. "Jane. I didn't want you to find out like this. I never wanted to hurt you." I felt the tears come, but I couldn't let them fall. "How long, Helen? How long has this been going on? Don't lie to me." I'm so sorry," she whispered. "It started a long time ago. I never meant for it to get this far, but I couldn't stop it. And neither could Philip." I heard the confession in her voice, the weight of the truth. She wasn't just sorry for me, she was sorry for herself too. The reality of it all sank in. The betrayal was deeper than I could have ever imagined. I didn't know what to say after that. I didn't know what I wanted from her. I just wanted it to stop. But it wasn't going to. This was just the beginning. And I didn't know if I could survive it. But I would. I had to. And as the conversation ended, I knew things would never be the same again. Nothing would ever be the same. I had reached the point of no return. The lies, the deceit, the secrecy, it was all too much. I couldn't go on pretending everything was fine, couldn't keep smiling through the pain. No. I had to confront them. Helen, Philip, Richard, they all needed to face the consequences of what they had done. And I needed the truth, even if it shattered me further. I had spent the last few days gathering my thoughts, planning every word carefully. This confrontation had to happen. I couldn't let them get away with it. Not after everything they had stolen from me. My trust. My peace of mind. My family. So, I called them. The three of them. And I told them to meet me at the house. I didn't care if they were busy or if they had other plans. I had given them enough time to lie, to cover their tracks, but I wasn't waiting any longer. When they arrived, I could feel the tension hanging in the air. Philip walked in first, his usual confident stride faltering when he saw me standing there, arms crossed, my eyes burning with the fury I had been holding inside for so long. Helen followed behind him, her face a mask of calm, but I could see the unease in her eyes. Richard was last to enter, looking like he had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but even he couldn't hide the guilt behind his cold demeanor. I didn't waste time. I spoke first, my voice trembling with anger but also a sense of cold finality. I know everything, I said, my words slicing through the air. I know about you and Richard. I know about you and Philip. And I know you've been lying to me for God knows how long. There was a long silence. I could feel the weight of their guilt pressing down on the room, but none of them spoke. Not at first. Then Richard surprised me. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. You're right, Jane. I've known about Philip's involvement for a long time. He didn't tell you, but I did. I was just as complicit as they were. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. Richard had known? He'd known about Philip all along? That twisted, smug bastard had been playing me the entire time. And all the while, I had thought I was the only one left in the dark. The betrayal stung deeper than anything I had felt before. Not only had my sister and husband lied to me, but so had the man I had trusted to be the most honest one in the house. I tried to stop it, Richard continued, his voice becoming quieter, almost as though he was trying to justify himself. But it wasn't enough. They had already gone too far. And truth be told, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop them at all. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There was no remorse in his voice, no regret. Just cold indifference. He didn't care. None of them did. Helen looked away, her cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. Not a word. The silence between us stretched on, thick with the weight of the truth. Then Philip spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he had rehearsed what he was about to say. Jane, I never meant for you to find out this way. But if I'm being honest, I've never really been happy with you. I've tried, I really have, but something was missing. And when Helen and I reconnected, it just felt right. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had never expected Philip to admit it so casually, as if it was just a part of the inevitable flow of things. As if I wasn't even worth the effort of lying to me one last time. He had been my husband, my partner. The person I trusted with my entire life. And now he was standing there, telling me he was never truly happy. Telling me he had found solace in my own sister's arms. The sting of his words cut through me like 1,000 blades. It wasn't just the affair, it was the fact that he had never cared enough to try and fix things with me. To talk to me, to be honest with me. All those years of pretending, of telling me everything was fine. All of it was a lie. I looked at Helen, my sister. The woman I had always trusted to have my back. The woman I had confided in, the woman I had called my best friend. And here she was, standing there, her face a mixture of guilt and defiance. She didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. You're pathetic, I said, the words coming out sharp and cold. Both of you. I thought I could trust you. But all this time, you've been deceiving me. You've been lying to my face, and for what? A cheap affair? Helen's lips trembled, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. There was nothing left to say. Philip and Helen exchanged a glance, but they didn't look at me. They didn't seem to care. They were too wrapped up in their own little world, too busy justifying their betrayal. And Richard? He was no better. He was complicit in all of this, and yet he stood there, unbothered by the wreckage they had left behind. I wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but instead, I felt something cold settle inside me. I felt nothing. Nothing but the hollow echo of their indifference. I had trusted them all. And now, I was completely alone. I turned away from them, my heart breaking with the weight of it all. But as I walked out of the room, something inside me shifted. I realized I wasn't just alone. I was stronger than I had ever been. And if this was the price I had to pay for the truth, then so be it. But the price was high. Too high. And I didn't know if I could ever forgive them for it. I thought I could start over. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could find some kind of peace in the aftermath of all the chaos. But peace was a foreign concept now. Trust? That was gone. It had been ripped away from me, piece by piece, by the people I loved most. The people I thought I could trust forever. I had nowhere to turn, no one to lean on. But then I remembered Tom, an old friend from my university days. He was someone who always had a way of making me laugh, of easing my mind when life felt heavy. It had been years since we had seen each other, but I decided to reach out. Maybe he could offer me the comfort I desperately needed, the reassurance that not everyone was capable of the kind of betrayal I had suffered. I called him. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in town, a place we had frequented during our university years. It seemed fitting, in a way. It felt like a lifetime ago. Before everything had gone so horribly wrong. When I walked into the cafe, I saw him right away. He hadn't changed much. Still the same friendly smile, the same warm eyes. I felt a flicker of relief, but it didn't last long. Tom was someone I could always count on, right? We sat down, exchanged pleasantries, and for a while, I almost believed things could go back to normal. But as I started talking about what had happened, about Philip, Helen, Richard, Tom grew strangely quiet. He didn't react the way I expected him to. He didn't offer me comfort or even surprise at my revelation. No, he just sat there, listening with a strange, detached expression on his face. That was when I noticed something. A subtle shift in his demeanor. Something wasn't right. He was avoiding my gaze, tapping his fingers nervously on the table, his eyes flickering away whenever I asked him a direct question. And then it hit me. A memory, buried deep, surfaced in the back of my mind. There had been moments before, moments when Tom and Richard exchanged knowing looks, too many to count. "Tom," I said, my voice suddenly thick with suspicion. "Why are you acting like this? What aren't you telling me?" His face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. My stomach twisted. "You were involved, weren't you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You knew about Philip and Helen. You were a part of this web of lies." Tom finally looked at me, his expression resigned. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he muttered, his voice low. "I never meant to hurt you, Jane. But I was involved, in more ways than you can imagine." I felt the blood drain from my face. My old friend, the one person I thought I could trust, had been part of the betrayal all along. He had known, and yet he had stood by, silent. Watching me fall apart. Watching me get torn apart by lies. And he had done nothing. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, but the apology felt hollow. It meant nothing now. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Disbelief? Perhaps all of it. But there was no time to process. There was more to this story than I realized, and Tom's confession had only scratched the surface. I left the cafe in a daze, unable to comprehend the depth of the lies surrounding me. But there was still something I needed to understand, something that had been nagging at me ever since I found out about the affair. Why? Why had Helen done this? She had never seemed unhappy with Philip. They had always been close. But the pieces didn't fit. I went home, replaying every conversation I had ever had with Helen, every moment we had shared. And then, it hit me like a lightning bolt. Helen hadn't been in love with Philip. No. She had been in love with someone else. Someone much closer. I couldn't wrap my head around it. It was unthinkable. My own sister had been in love with Richard all along. Not just a casual affair. She had been deeply in love with him. The affair with Philip was nothing more than a way to distract herself from what she truly wanted. The truth was even worse than I had imagined. I could feel the walls closing in around me. The web of lies was so tangled now that I couldn't see where it started or ended. But as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, I realized that I had been blind to Richard's true motives. All along, he had been playing his own game. Richard didn't care about Helen or Philip. He didn't care about any of us. What he cared about was control. He had manipulated everyone, my husband, my sister, even me. He had gotten close to them because it suited his plan. And now, I realized that everything he had done had been with one goal in mind: to tear us apart. He wanted to watch it all burn. The truth was worse than anything I could have ever imagined. And yet, I still had questions. So many questions. Why? What did Richard want from me? What had all of this really been about? As I sat there in the silence of my own home, I realized that I would never get the answers I was looking for. There was no neat resolution, no closure. Only the painful truth that I had been a pawn in a game that I couldn't even begin to understand. And now, I don't know what comes next. My life has been torn apart by the people I loved and trusted. But I can't just walk away. I need answers. I need to know why all of this happened. And if you're watching this, I need your help. If anyone out there has ever been through something like this, I need you to tell me. How do I move on when everything I thought I knew has been shattered? Tell me, because right now, I'm lost. I need answers. I don't know where else to turn. I couldn't breathe. The weight of everything I had learned over the past few weeks felt like a suffocating cloud, pressing down on me with a force I couldn't escape. As much as I wanted to be done with it all, to walk away from the nightmare that had become my life, something inside me refused to let go. I needed to know the truth. All of it. I needed to understand what Richard's real game was, what he was after, and why everything had been so carefully orchestrated. But the answers didn't come easily. No, they came with a twist. A twist that sent a cold chill down my spine, one that I could never have prepared for. I started digging deeper into Richard's background. I had to. I had to know what kind of person I was dealing with. Who was this man who had manipulated me, my sister, my husband, and even Tom? Everyone had been playing their part in his twisted game, and I needed to understand why. I contacted some of Richard's old acquaintances, people who might know more about his life before he moved in with us. The responses I got were vague at first, people reluctant to talk. But then I came across something, a name, a place, a connection that I never, ever saw coming. Richard's past wasn't just some random set of circumstances. It was tied to someone close to me in ways I could never have anticipated. The name was familiar, but I couldn't place it at first. As I dug further, the pieces began to fall into place with terrifying clarity. Richard wasn't just a stranger with a dark agenda, he had been involved in a web of manipulation that stretched back years. Years before he ever set foot in my house. It hit me hard, like a slap to the face. The person I thought was just another pawn in his game was someone I trusted, someone I loved. Richard had been using this person all along, and they had no idea just how deep his reach went. The realization made my skin crawl. Richard hadn't just come into our lives as a random tenant. No, he had orchestrated everything from the start. He had found his way into our circle because of the connections he had, connections that tied him to someone I was supposed to be able to trust completely. And this person who had been so close to me, had played a role in the web of lies I was now drowning in. I felt like I was going to be sick. This whole time, I had been so focused on Philip, on Helen, on Richard's affair with my sister, that I had completely missed the most terrifying aspect of it all. It wasn't just about love, it was never about love. It was about something far more sinister. Richard had been manipulating people for years, playing a dangerous game with people's hearts, using them to get what he wanted. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized that it wasn't just about breaking hearts for him. No, Richard had a much darker purpose. He wanted to destroy everything. He wanted to tear apart the people I loved, to break us in ways we could never recover from. And now I had to face the terrifying truth: I had been a part of this game all along. My trust in my sister, in my husband, in my friends, had all been used against me. I had been the target, the final piece in Richard's twisted puzzle. But it didn't stop there. I realized something even more horrifying, that the game was far from over. The pieces were still moving, and Richard was still pulling the strings. I had thought I was at the end of it, that I had finally uncovered the truth. But no. The truth was just the beginning. Richard had been playing a long game, and it wasn't finished. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks: I wasn't the only one being manipulated. Everyone in my life had been pawns, and we had all been set up. The betrayal, the lies, the secrets, they were just the first act in a much bigger plan. I had thought the affair was the worst part of it. I had thought the lies were the worst part. But now, I knew better. As I sat there, the weight of it all crashing down on me, I felt something dark stirring within me. Fear? Anger? No, it was something else. It was the desire for revenge. Richard had ruined everything I had ever known. He had destroyed my family, my trust, my peace. And now, I was going to make him pay. But even as I thought that, a new fear took root in my chest. What if he was already steps ahead of me? What if this was all just another part of his game? I didn't know who to trust anymore. Everyone had lied, everyone had betrayed me. And now I was left with nothing but the cold, bitter reality that the game had only just begun. The doorbell rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. Who could it be now? Was it Richard? Or someone else playing their part in his game? I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do, what to expect. But I knew one thing for certain: the truth was out there, and it was about to destroy everything. I walked toward the door, bracing myself for whatever came next. But as I opened it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking straight into a trap. And this time, there would be no escape. If you're still with me, you know this story isn't over. Please subscribe to the channel, because the truth is darker than you think, and I can't do this alone. You won't want to miss what comes next. Trust me.